The woman stood under the shower, letting the hot water stream over her tired body. It had been a long day, and the warmth was a welcome relief. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back, allowing the water to wash away the stress. The bathroom was filled with steam, turning the small, tiled room into a cocoon of warmth and mist. She barely noticed the water pooling at her feet, the drain struggling to keep up with the flow. The scent of lavender soap filled the air as she lathered her skin, her mind drifting to thoughts of sleep and the soft bed waiting for her. The steady rhythm of the water hitting the tiles was soothing, almost hypnotic, but then something broke the tranquility of sound. At first, it was so faint she thought it might have been her imagination. A whisper barely audible, mingling with the hiss of the shower. Her eyes snapped open, and she listened, the water still cascading over her.
I see you.
The words were unmistakable this time, sending a jolt of fear through her. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but all she saw were the familiar walls of her bathroom, now blurry with steam. Her breath quickened, a cold dread settling in her stomach, a stark contrast to the warmth of the water. Slowly, she looked down at the drain, the source of the unsettling whisper. The water circling it was murky, swirling with soap and hair. It gurgled slightly, as if something were caught just below the surface. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost as loud as the rushing water. She couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a terror she couldn't explain. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss it, pipes creaking, the wind outside, anything but what it really sounded like. But the voice came again, louder, more distinct.
I see you.
Her pulse raced, each beat echoing in her ears. She quickly reached out and turned off the shower, the abrupt silence amplifying her fear. Water dripped from her body, the drops pattering softly against the porcelain tub. The air felt suddenly colder, the steam dissipating, leaving her exposed to whatever had spoken. She stepped out of the shower, her movements frantic and unsteady. The towel she grabbed felt rough against her damp skin, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were glued to the drain, watching for any sign of movement, any hint that something might crawl out of it. She wiped the mirror with a trembling hand, the steam clearing to reveal her reflection. Her face was pale, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes wide with terror. The mirror reflected the empty bathroom behind her, the door slightly ajar, the shadows outside seeming darker, more menacing. She turned her attention back to the drain, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The water was draining slowly, reluctantly, as if something were blocking the flow. She leaned in closer, trying to see what it could be, but the drain was clogged with nothing more than hair and soap. As she stared, the voice came again, but this time, it felt as though it was coming from right behind her, close enough to send a shiver down her spine.
I see you.
Her blood ran cold. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the bathroom was empty. Her fear turned into a desperate need to escape. She hurried out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind her as if that would keep whatever it was at bay. She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock it. The battery was dangerously low, just 2, and the screen flickered as she tried to dial a number, any number. But before she could complete the call, the screen went black, the phone dying in her hand. Now completely isolated, she felt the walls closing in on her, the silence oppressive. She stood there, in the dimly lit hallway, trying to gather her thoughts, but all she could think of was the voice. The weight had seemed to creep into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a snake. There was no way she was staying in the house. She grabbed her keys, still in her towel, and ran for the door, the hardwood floor cold beneath her bare feet. She didn't stop to put on shoes or clothes. All she could think about was getting as far away as possible. She jumped into her car, her wet skin sticking to the seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. As she drove away, she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. But there was nothing. Just the quiet streets of her neighborhood, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. She kept driving, not sure where she was going, only knowing she needed to be somewhere safe. But even as the house disappeared in the distance, the voice lingered in her mind, a sinister whisper she couldn't escape.
I see you.
As she drove, the night stretched out before her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound, but in her mind, the voice echoed, relentless and chilling. It was low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against pavement, with a sinister edge that sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just in her head, that the voice was somehow real, a malevolent presence that had latched onto her. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:17 a.m. The roads were deserted, the city asleep, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the terror that had gripped her since the shower. She needed to get to safety, somewhere she could think clearly and figure out what was happening. But where could she go? Who would believe her? Her mind raced through options: friends, family, but she couldn't bring herself to involve anyone else in this nightmare. Whatever it was, it seemed personal, as if the voice had chosen her, and she didn't want to put anyone else at risk. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the fear was overwhelming. The voice had spoken to her, taunted her, and even though she was miles away from the house now, it still felt close, lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness. She spotted a motel sign flickering in the distance and made a quick decision. Pulling into the parking lot, she parked under a street light, its dim glow offering little comfort. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the word vacancy flickering erratically. It was a cheap, run-down place, but it was better than being out in the open. Inside, the lobby was deserted, a bell on the counter the only sign of life. She rang it, her hand trembling. After what felt like an eternity, a tired-looking clerk appeared, barely glancing at her as he handed over a key. Room 12, down the hall. She made her way to the room, the hallway dimly lit and smelling faintly of mildew. Once inside, she locked the door and bolted it for good measure. The room was small and dingy, with faded wallpaper and a bed that had seen better days, but she didn't care. She just needed a place to rest, to collect her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in her towel, her wet hair sticking to her back. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, but for the first time since she had heard the voice, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. Maybe she could finally think, figure out what was happening to her. But as soon as she began to relax, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the room was plunged into darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone, hoping against hope that it would turn on. But the screen remained black, lifeless, and then she heard it again.
I see you.
The voice was clearer now, no longer just a whisper. It was all around her, surrounding her, filling the room with its eerie presence. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. This time, she knew it wasn't coming from the drain or some distant place. It was right there, in the room with her. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the faintest shadow in the corner of the room. It was dark, almost blending in with the walls, but it moved slightly, a shifting shape that made her breath catch in her throat. The voice came again, more insistent, almost gleeful now. I see you. She backed up against the wall, her legs trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The shadow seemed to grow, stretching across the room, inching closer and closer. She could feel it now, an icy coldness that seeped into her bones, paralyzing her with fear. And then, just as the shadow loomed over her, swallowing the last bit of light in the room, she heard it one final time, right in her ear, as if the voice was inside her head.
I see you.
Everything went black. When the clerk came to check on the room the next morning, he found it empty. The bed was neatly made, the towels untouched. There was no sign of the woman who had checked in the night before, no trace of her at all, except for a faint, lingering chill in the air, and a quiet whisper that seemed to echo in the stillness.
I see you.